dissolve the Iranian parliament and to give him, Mossadegh, unilateral power until the crisis was over. He essentially was calling for effectively to have one-man rule. And the measure passed by 99%. 99% of Iranians who voted on that referendum said, yeah, we're in favor of it. Before we get started, let me remind everyone, you need to check people who think that they're subscribed, but they're really not. Also, if you're not following me on Twitter, you should. That's where a number of the professor's pearls of wisdom get dropped. Now, let's go ahead and get into the heart of this evening's video essay. There are some people who are going to be the habitually disagreeable or the people who just want to argue for argument's sake. So from the outset, let me say that the Persians, Iranians, whatever you want to call them, they are not our friends. As Dr. John Henry Clark put it, Africa's enemies came from Asia long before they started coming from Europe. I feel compelled to have to mention that because you always got a few people who are looking for attention who try that, and some of these people might wind up getting blocked if they keep it up. Now, we don't have a dog in this dust-up between the United States and Iran. It's an argument between a couple of thugs who are trying to figure out who's going to be the big dog in the Middle East. But that's not to say that the former slaves cannot learn anything simply from observing it. Indeed, there's a lot that can be gleaned by looking closely at what's happening between Iran and the United States, and also more to be learned when you take the long view. Why is this going on? Well, there's the white media's version of it, and then there's what actually happened. Of course, we have to go back a few years. Shortly after World War I, you had a situation where the Pahlavi family came to be the rulers of Iran. In 1925, the royal family of Qajar was deposed from power by the Persian, well, soon-to-be Iranian parliament. Now, why did this happen? Why did the Iranian parliament decide that the old king had to go? Well, it was because he failed to stop British and Soviet invasions on Persian sovereignty. See, if someone wants to call themselves being a leader, then they also must be able to maintain the state, as Dr. John Henry Clark explained. And if your leader fails to do that, then he should lose everything. He wants to be the boss. He wants to be the one calling the shots. He wants to make these decisions that will impact the lives of untold millions and impact the lives of generations not born. And that being the case, he better be up to the task. He better not be there because he just was the idiot who managed to maneuver himself the best or he elbowed his way. He better be the most capable guy in the room. And he should know that before he goes calling himself seeking that brass ring. And in the event that he's not up to the job, then he is supposed to be punished harshly. Organizations who are serious about their power, they make sure that anybody who wants to be the boss understands the price of failure, and the price should be severe. Other groups practice this standard, and that's why their leaders take their position seriously. Other groups expect their representatives. This is the reason why when black people voice our concerns, these other people's representatives, they already know what their ethnic group expects them to do. As Dr. Anderson said, politicians react to the economy underneath them. And that even goes for people who are impoverished. Because if you don't have any material resources for the politician to respond to, then you better make sure that your poverty manifests itself in physical form. Politicians react to that too, especially when it's consistent. But anyway, Reza Pahlavi was the first Shah of Iran, but he didn't last long. In 1941, the Brits told him to let his son take over. And so the Shah and his family lived palatially, which would be fine if he was a private citizen, but this was supposed to be the leader of an entire nation and the man responsible for the state's economy. For him to live high on the hog, pal around with the Brits, the Americans, and the Russians, while the average Iranian citizen was destitute, that didn't go over well at all. Now, in time, Mohammad Mossadegh became prime minister of Iran, and he began reviewing Iran's petroleum dealings with the then Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later be renamed British Petroleum. Prime Minister Mossadegh looked and said, this situation is a complete and thorough ripoff. How the hell are we going to let the Brits have damn near 60% ownership stake in our oil? How the hell are we going to let them tell us what to do? And so he told the Brits that the deal was off. He nationalized the Iranian oil industry, effectively taking it back from the British. Now, Britain then, as now, is highly dependent on Iranian oil to pay their bills. And as far as the United States goes, the U.S. needs oil in order to prop up the dollar. Ever since Aramco, the U.S. forced the world to trade for oil in dollars. That's where the term petrodollars comes from. What that means is if the U.S. declares that it's not going to let you have any dollars, then you have no way to buy or sell oil. That's what it effectively means. They decided they would get the U.S. to begin agitating for the removal of Prime Minister Mossadegh by bribing and otherwise incentivizing Mossadegh's fellow Iranians like the Shah and some of the people who were out in the boondocks, a lot of the people, those rural yokels. The U.S. started trying to get them to agitate for Mossadegh to be removed. All you need is some street protests and a few people to say, oh, he's so mean, and you can run, you're off to the races. And it's all meant to set the stage to get him forced out of office. It didn't matter how many people wanted him in there. It's just a matter, we got to manufacture the right headlines, manufacture the right photographs, manufacture the right newsreels. Problem was, Mossadegh was overwhelmingly loved by the people of Iran, to the point where even the Shah was scared to try to remove him. As far as he was concerned, I get rid of Mossadegh, the people are going to get rid of me. So the British and the CIA settled on a strategy of constructing a narrative meant to make the coup more politically acceptable. The chosen lie that they settled on would be that Mossadegh was a socialist, and that this socialist would hand Iran's oil over to the Soviets any moment. At least that's what they were saying. Now, of course, that's ridiculous on its face. There is no instance in the entirety of human history of any leader of a nation nationalizing his country's resources and then handing it over to somebody else. It defeats the whole purpose of what you're doing. The entire reason that you would nationalize the oil fields to get them out of the hands of the British is because you did not want them in the hands of another country. But the thing is, this is the kind of tortured logic, such as it is, and the kind of psychological pretzels that the British and the Americans will put out there. And there's always a few rubes who basically stop listening to anything you say once you say certain trigger words. We know the people on the reactionary right, as soon as you say the word socialist, that's it. They completely tuned out everything you've said after that, and they're basically a puppet at that point. So, how did the CIA begin to carry out its little propaganda offensive against Prime Minister Mossadegh? What it did was it had a series of false flag operations. They would hire a bunch of Iranian locals who would pretend to be supporters of Mossadegh and his policies. But these people were actually paid CIA agents. I think that bears repeating because I want to make sure that you understand that. What the CIA did was they paid certain Iranians to go out in the streets and cause trouble and make a ruckus, and these Iranians would be pretending to be supporters of Mossadegh, pretending to support his policies, but making sure whenever they got in front of news cameras, who were also people put in place by the U.S. and British governments, be sure to say, we are here because we believe in these socialist policies. Mossadegh has a socialist future, and we're here to make sure that the socialist future comes to pass. And that's what they did. They paid people to pretend as if they were supporting Prime Minister Mossadegh when they were actually CIA plants. Now, gee, doesn't that sound like something we've had occur with us recently? You know, government operatives, former prosecutors, former congressional staffers who are now trying to reinvent themselves as black power activists, but who are actually in the pockets of white power. Gee, I wonder. Anyway, back then in the 1950s in Iran, these CIA-paid agitators began making problems in the streets, and at that point, Mossadegh, who began to read the tea leaves, and he could clearly see what it was that the U.S. and the Brits were trying to cook up, he called for a referendum of the people to vote to dissolve the Iranian parliament and to give him, Mossadegh, unilateral power until the crisis was over. He essentially was calling for effectively to have one-man rule. And the measure passed by 99%. 99% of Iranians who voted on that referendum said, yeah, we're in favor of it. They could see what was happening too. And so the U.S., realizing that it had to strike fast, told the Shah to go ahead and dismiss Mossadegh as prime minister. They made it clear to the Shah, you don't get this Mossadegh guy out of here, we're prepared to move without you. Which of course was letting him know, hey, if we got to move without you, then what the hell do we need you for? So the Shah, he went ahead and said, you know what, I'm calling for Prime Minister Mossadegh's resignation. In fact, I'm not even sure if the Shah was in Iran at the time. I think he did it while he was overseas. And even though the Shah's decree did not undercut Mossadegh's support, what it did do was it gave the CIA exactly the headlines that it wanted. It gave them exactly the political justification that they were looking for, at least on the surface. Why? The king, the ruler of Iran, has an out-of-control prime minister, and well, he can't handle this guy himself, so we, being the good freedom-loving, peace-loving people that we are in the U.S., why, look at the Negroes if you need any more proof of how peace-loving we are. We're going to go ahead and help the Shah out, because clearly he's in over his head, and this Mossadegh guy is out of control. Why, look at these socialists in the streets. Where the hell they come from? And that's when the U.S. said, all right then, time to get Mossadegh out of here. We'll do it ourselves. And that's when you had the real insurrection began. Street riots, orchestrated and paid for by the CIA, took place. And in order to control the anti-democratic forces of Mossadegh, the Shah had no choice but to call out the military. But the military didn't spend much time dealing with those protesters in the streets, because after all, the CIA had given them their paycheck and it's time for them to go home. But who the Iranian military did immediately go after was the Prime Minister's office. The military arrested Mossadegh, they tried him, they put him in prison briefly, which was followed by house arrest for the remainder of his life. Now, that's a political prisoner 101, but that's what happened to the Prime Minister of Iran, who decided that he wasn't going to give away his people's vital national resources. Next, the U.S. had Shah Pahlavi install a U.S.-selected puppet to be the new Prime Minister, and this one, of course, was a rubber stamp for the U.S. This new guy just restored all the old bad agreements and the scam, the robbing of Iran's oil for the sake of white petrochemical corporations and the U.S. and British government's own personal benefit went on as always. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, figured that his white supremacist pals made the will of the Iranian people irrelevant, so he could push forward with the plans that his good white paymasters were telling him to do to transform the whole of Iranian society into one that would be much more submissive to Western power. And what that meant was the Shah was supposed to preside over the dismantling of Iran's culture. You see, culture means the particular way that a group does things. That's what the word culture means. It's a manifestation of a group's identity. And when you strip a people of their culture, after that you can graft onto them any identity you want. And you can tell them this is normal for you because you've robbed them of the knowledge of what actually is normal for them. This is what the U.S. wanted the Shah to do, and this is what he tried to carry out. The Iranian people fully recognized that the Shah was merely a U.S.-British puppet, and this became most excruciatingly clear in 1963 when the Shah began pushing a number of Western reforms onto Iran, which the Shah called his White Revolution. I'm not making that up. That's what he called it. Wow. The White Revolution. Well, talk about truth in advertising. It was white, all right. Definitely who was behind it and who it was meant to benefit. And it's one of the U.S. government's own websites that admits that the United States has a high interest in Iran, not just because of its oil, but because of its location in the region, which is just south of the then Soviet Union, which then as now is a rival to the United States. There's a lot of benefits that the United States could reap if it could get, or rather reinstall, a government that would do what Washington wants. Iran is centrally placed for that purpose. Now, as you would expect, the white media gives a hideously edited version of what the white revolution was. The white media makes it seem like, well, all it was about was voting rights for women. That's the white revolution. It was voting rights for women, and that's the line that they usually push. Well, the problem was the white revolution changed a hell of a lot more than just that. Part of the white revolution involved the Iranian parliament granting all U.S. military personnel in their country full diplomatic immunity, meaning that the law could not touch any U.S. soldier no matter what they did. I want you to think about that. Yeah. Legal immunity. Not just for diplomats, which you would expect, that's who it's supposed to apply to, but also for the soldiers who the U.S. put in Iran as well. This is what white power insisted on, that the same way white people are immune from the law in the United States, they demanded that the Iranians give white people the same legal immunity there as well. So a bunch of podunk hillbillies with their Confederate flags would have a license to rape and kill women in Iran. That's what it would amount to. And the worst that would happen to them is that they would be expelled from the country. But that's it. As we've seen so often in the U.S., good old boys and other assorted deplorables gleefully carry out all manner of beatings and rapes of black women, even murders, and they routinely engage in this behavior in the foreign countries that they're stationed in the military, and under the Shah, there was nothing that the host country could do about it. That was the plan anyway. So this was effectively to make white Americans in Iran into super citizens. Not just a handful of exceptions, but there would be an entire group running around Iranian society who the law could not touch. In return, the United States gave Iran $200 million for military equipment. When the people of Iran saw this, and especially the Iranian clergy, they looked and said, well, it's pretty obvious what the going price for Shah Reza Pahlavi's soul is, $200 million, and there you go. And speaking of Iranian clergy, since religion has always been the key to that region, the Shah decided that he would target Iran's clerics as well. The White Revolution involved a heavy campaign to diminish the power of the Iranian clerics, who had been the cultural gatekeepers. They had been the ones who the Shah looked at as being the only real competition to his rule. Because disputes and everyday matters were not handled by the Shah or by the Iranian government. They were largely handled according to tradition. And that tradition was maintained and carried out by the clerics. They were the ones who were the enforcers of Iranian culture. And it was not left up to the politicians or self-appointed kings to do whatever they found to be the most personally expedient. The clerics wanted to maintain the inherently Islamic character of Iran. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, on the other hand, wanted to get rid of that, and to get rid of anyone who refused to do things the white way. The Iranian people, realizing they had been betrayed, began looking around to find other voices to look to for guidance. The people were determined to maintain their Islamic identity, and even if you called yourself the king, the Iranian people would turn their backs on you if you were off code. See, the Iranian people understood what being on code means. That comes from the grassroots. It doesn't come from any leader. That's the reason why looking to a man to be the leader is a bad idea. The Iranian people did not put their faith and future in the hands of a man. They put it in the hands of their code. And back in the 1960s, they were on code as they are today. The code is their leader. Any so-called representative, the only thing he is merely an agreed-upon facilitator of the code. I was on Twitter about that earlier today. That when you have a leader, that's not supposed to be somebody who you are following around slavishly and you don't question anything. No, he is your servant. The code is the leader.
Great Scott.
That's the only logical purpose that voting serves, or trying to find some person to put into a particular office of government. The only logic, the only purpose that could serve is for that person to facilitate the code. And it is the people's job to be code enforcement. Because what happens when the facilitator turns against the people? Then the people find a new facilitator, and you make sure to punish the old one. That's part of the code too. The guy can't just be allowed to saunter out the door as if, oh, well, I guess I'm done. It's like, no, we're going to put a couple of knots on your head, and you better pray that's where it stops. That's code enforcement. In 1963, the Shah thought that he was the leader. Well, the Iranian people were about to show the Shah exactly who was in charge, and it wasn't him. Enter a then well-known cleric named Sayyid Ruhollah Musavi Khomeini, who went by the Islamic Ayatollah Khomeini. The Ayatollah Khomeini began to produce sermons pointing out the corruption of the Shah's regime, specifically how the Shah lived in opulence and totally ignored the needs of the people who lived in poverty. The Shah was more interested in protecting the oil interests of his white backers than withstanding his nation on its feet. But the Ayatollah Khomeini also made it a point to rail against what he called the Shah's dependence on Israel. After all, it was the Israelis who the Shah called on to train his state security force, the Savak. Khomeini was himself a staunch supporter of the Palestinians, and Khomeini repeatedly voiced his opposition to the existence of Palestine having been displaced by Israel. That a world leader who stridently advocated for Palestine in his speeches also sat on top of so much oil, that was a threat for Israel and the U.S. The U.S. was trying to reshape the political profile of the Middle East, and that means having only Islamic leaders who are not opposed to the occupation of Palestine, or who at most are lukewarm on the issue. This way, the Arab public and the world would accept the displacement of the Palestinians because, after all, you don't see the leaders of these Middle Eastern countries getting worked up over it, so it must not be that big a deal. But the Arab street cares about Palestine and what it represents. And having someone who reminds the Arab street that an Islamic leader is supposed to be standing with Palestine and that the situation of the Palestinians is intolerable, this was a growing threat. It was clear that in the Ayatollah Khomeini, regardless of his flaws, the U.S. was being confronted with a man who could not be bribed, a man who could not be threatened, and a man who could not be persuaded otherwise. He was a true believer, and exactly the wrong kind of example to be setting for the Arab world. White power wanted the Arab people to expect their leaders to be corrupt, to expect them to be equivocal, expect their leaders to put white nations' interests before their own. All the regime change in the Middle East, all that regime change has basically been a large-scale project to condition and maintain the people of the Middle East ideal to expect their leaders to be corrupt and to accept that status quo. Khomeini, however, continually railed against the Shah's so-called reforms, and he even warned the Shah that he could well find himself compelled to leave Iran if he continued on this course. The Iranian people loved it. This was a man who stood up for their culture, a man who said the things that they said, a man who put their interests first, a man who spoke up unapologetically and fearlessly for them. The people were angry. Ayatollah Khomeini simply gave voice to that anger, the anger that already existed. The Shah refused to stop his so-called reforms, and Khomeini continued to criticize them. Eventually, the anger that Khomeini had warned about erupted in the streets. The Shah blamed the Ayatollah Khomeini personally for this, and he had the man imprisoned. The Ayatollah was then forced into exile in Turkey, then Iraq, and finally in France. But the Ayatollah Khomeini never stopped his sermons attacking the Shah's regime, and he never stopped planning what a post-Shah Iran was going to look like. Ayatollah Khomeini was shut out of all broad-based forms of media. He had no actual media platform of his own, so he decided to create one. What he did was he would have his sermons tape recorded, and then his supporters would smuggle these recordings into Iran, where they would be played for the people. In exile, the Ayatollah's influence had grown larger than it was when he had been in the country. See, the real fuel for the Ayatollah Khomeini's power wasn't his sermons. It was the continued corruption of Shah Reza Pahlavi. Now, if the Shah had stopped dismantling the Islamic identity of Iran, stopped being a Western stooge, then no one would have listened to the Ayatollah because there would have been no reason to. But, as it was, Khomeini kept preaching his truth, and the people kept listening, and that listenership grew and grew year by year, as did the anger in the Arab street. And there was nothing the Shah could do about it now. He had placed, because of his actions, he had placed the Ayatollah Khomeini far beyond his reach. See, the Iranians understood that a people who do not stand up for their advocates will have no advocates. Whenever you have an oppressed group, there will always be those who speak up for the people. But the thing is, these are individuals who the dominant society will take aim at. For the sake of destroying them, go ahead and discredit or find a way to reduce them in power if you can. Kill them if you must. Not because of the fact that these spokespeople have power, but because of the fact that their message is a threat. That you're creating a culture of defiance. And that is the one thing that any oppressor class is going to be determined to keep those they oppress from having. A culture of defiance, true defiance, not a little bit of grumbling, not a culture of murmuring or of impotently playing on the sidelines when you're looking and going, God dang it, we're going to change the situation. Now, you can't have people getting a daily diet of defiance. You cannot have that. But that's exactly what Ayatollah Khomeini was feeding the Iranian people. And they were listening, and they were embracing his message, and they were supporting him as a result. Ayatollah Khomeini was a true elder for the people in Iran. He wasn't some irrelevant old man running around telling them, you should respect me because I got gray hair. He was telling them, this is the way we're going to get our country back. Khomeini earned his people's respect, and that's the reason why, unlike the Shah, he never had to demand it. He never had to demand his people's respect. He commanded it because of who he was and the ideals that he espoused, what he represented. And so, by the late 1970s, the people of Iran rose up again at the behest of Ayatollah Khomeini. Only this time, there would be no way to stop it. You see, Ayatollah Khomeini understood the necessity of being able to strike at his enemies from the shadows. That's why I keep using that old U.S. Navy submariners saying, run silent, run deep. Because of the fact that he was not determined to have some big tent, some big gathering that the Shah could see. What he was doing was he was taking his message to the people and not doing it in a way that would allow the Shah to be able to strike at him. When you are in a fight against evil, you're not supposed to be looking for a level playing field. You're supposed to make sure that playing field is as lopsided in your favor as possible. When you're dealing with an evil like this, you don't try to figure out how to have a fair fight. Forget about fair. I value fair competition with honorable people. But when it comes to the dishonorable and the disgusting and the corrupt, forget it. There are no rules other than the good guys must win. That's the only rule. Khomeini knew where his opponent was at. Khomeini knew and was letting everybody know, this is the guy that we're going to be taking down. The Shah, on the other hand, had no such advantage. That's what you got to do when you're an oppressed group. You got to make sure that you create every advantage for yourself against your enemy that you possibly can. And so, on January 16th, 1979, Shah Reza Pahlavi, who had been in power since the 1940s, was forced to flee Iran, as the Ayatollah Khomeini had prophesied. 2 weeks after that, Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile. Only this time it was not as a mere cleric, but now as the Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, the new ruler of a new Iran. The Ayatollah Khomeini began his reign by cleaning house. Anyone who had worked for or been loyal to the Shah was purged. That meant that they were executed. He was not going to allow any pro-Western fifth column to take root in his Iran. You see, the Ayatollah Khomeini had learned the lesson of what happened to Mohammad Mossadegh. He knew what kind of games the U.S. would try to play, and he cut it off before it even began. Now, you see, that's what happens when you got somebody who's serious about their power. The Haitian Revolution had the same thing happen, except they did that before they started agitating against the French. The biggest problem that any group of oppressed people have throwing off their chains are going to be the enemy within. This is a historical fact. This is a historical constant. Show me a group of oppressed people, and I'll show you a group of people who are riddled and run through with a whole bunch of turncoats, bootlicks, traitors, suck-ups, snitches, and informants. And if that group wants to be free, at some point they're going to have to confront the enemy within. They're going to have to get serious about the idea that, now, we ain't going to have all these snitches and all of these turncoats running around. That's off code, and there will be a price to pay for being off code. The Ayatollah Khomeini understood that lesson, and that's why the U.S. wasn't able to gin up some quickie revolution against them. There wasn't going to be any people in the streets saying that, oh, we just can't stand this Iran, we can't stand this Ayatollah, oh, he's this, he's that. No, you're not going to be sitting here putting together any phony baloney false flag operations for the camels. And just to make sure that the Islamic identity of Iran reasserted itself forcefully, the Ayatollah Khomeini dismantled the Shah's reforms, and he outlawed everything, including even Western music. That's how far he went with it. What he was doing was he was humiliating the former Shah. This was the humiliation of Reza Pahlavi. Because Reza Pahlavi's entire life, such as it was, had been dedicated to making Iran into nothing more than a whorehouse for the West, to completely strip it of its Islamic identity and to graft onto Iran a European identity. But the identity would not be anything other than imitation European serfs. They would just be a bunch of European peasants. That's the identity that Reza Pahlavi was attempting to graft onto Iran. And Pahlavi was just so sure that his white revolution had been successful. He was so sure that the people had accepted it, that it had taken with the people. He was so sure that he had completely changed Iran. But Ayatollah Khomeini proved him wrong. And just to make sure the Americans got the point, the Ayatollah also presided over the taking of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, with the U.S. Embassy staff being taken as hostages. Now, eventually, the Ayatollah Khomeini died in 1989, and yet the revolution that he set in motion over a quarter century earlier, the revolution didn't start in 79. The revolution started in 63. And that revolution has now far outlived the Ayatollah Khomeini. See, the white folks in the West, they figured that the Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was the leader of the revolution, but he understood that the ideology was the leader. See, if it was only just him as a leader, then what happens is he becomes irrelevant when you put him into exile. That's what happens if you have a leader who makes a movement into nothing more than a cult of personality. You have a particularly charismatic individual who really hasn't built anything that's going to survive beyond him or that can survive without him. So all you got to do is you got to kill the guy, you put him in prison, problem solved. That didn't work with the Ayatollah Khomeini, because the Ayatollah Khomeini was not the leader of the revolution. The ideology was the leader. The people listened to him because of the fact that he was the only one with the guts to stand up for the code. The people were waiting for somebody who would do so. The other clerics were kind of twiddling their thumbs and didn't want to step on any toes. And after all, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke beautifully pointed out, you go all throughout the Arab world, including in Iran, and you will find these allegedly so-called self-proclaimed devout Muslims who will be, as Dr. Clarke put it, drinking scotch, eating pork, and patronizing European whores. These guys do not really believe in anything. They'll go ahead and do that pious routine for the people, but as soon as these guys are away from the people, they're acting no better than their European counterparts. That tells you everything you need to know about them. The Ayatollah Khomeini wasn't like that. He believed what it was that he was saying. And that's what made him so dangerous to the Western powers, but that was also what made him so beloved by the Iranian people. He stood for their code. His defiance humiliated the U.S. and Britain. White supremacy doesn't believe in taking any L's. And they also believe in total control. So when a man who white power did not sanction begins riling up the people and white power can't control him or stop him, that's a problem. And that brings us to where we are today. Between the United States and Israel, we're looking at Iran and going this revolution that got set off. They're still embracing it. We have to break the collective will of the Iranian people. What that's going to require, you're going to need to bring in a stooge, somebody who's going to be nothing more than a puppet, but a very brutal, very repressive puppet. And that's what's been going on. The experiment the U.S. and Israel together have been hoping to pull off. That they can, if you have this center of power sitting on top of a lot of potential economic resources, and they're influential in the region because they actually stand on their religious principles, and there's a lot of people who believe the same thing in the region. So how are you going to get people off that? Well, you got to get somebody in a position of authority there. Get somebody who's going to call himself the leader, and he's going to say, you know what, new deal, new rules, all that old stuff is out the window, and why we're going to be doing very differently. What are you going to be doing? We're going to be doing whatever these white folks supposed to do. That's the goal. And by doing so, well, you're going to have one of the few holdouts against Western influence in the region that will be gone. And if the guys who have stood against it and held out the longest crumble, well, that would, as it's believed to be anyway, that would be such a psychological blow. Keep in mind, when people start saying this garbage about Iran's the world's largest sponsor of state terror, no, the biggest sponsor of state terror in the world is the United States. The United States carries out more terrorism inside its own borders than practically all the other so-called state sponsors of terrorism combined. How many people have died at the hands of the enforcement of white supremacy inside the United States? Now, how many people have died at the hands of terrorists globally in the last year? You go ahead and do an apples-to-apples comparison. It's like, man, you can't compare this. So this is what is going on whenever you hear them talking about state-sponsored terrorism. You're going to need to have a lie to hang your hat on. And regardless of what you may think of Iran personally, there is nothing you can say about Iran that you cannot say about the United States. Today, on my Twitter page, I was pointing out that all of this garbage about law enforcement appreciation day. You somebody had the nerve to actually put that on Twitter. Law enforcement appreciation day. Well, I went ahead and had some choice words about how much we appreciate the thugs in blue. But you had some idiot who, when I posted that the U.S. has more people behind bars than any other country on the planet, that the U.S. is the most incarcerated state on the planet, has more people behind bars than North Korea, more people behind bars than Iran, more people behind bars than China. China has 6 times the population of the U.S., but the U.S. has more people behind bars. Now, who's the police state here? The United States has pretty much the only actual professional school for terrorists, the School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia. All of those Latin American regimes responsible for God knows what kind of ghastly crimes. Where do you think that those guys got their training from? The U.S. provided it for them. And again, we have no dog in this fight, but the point that I'm making that I'm sure you guys are well aware of. Before you go listening to anyone trying to tell you how bad some other country is, you need to consider the source. Whatever acts of terror you want to accuse Iran of, fine. I'm not here to stand up for them. I'm not here to defend them. Just keep in mind that the main people who are pointing the dirty end of the stick at Iran, these are governments and people who have done far, far worse. Climate counts much worse by the U.S. than anything Iran could do. Think about that when they're trying to tell you we have to go to war because human life is so precious. I was posting on my Twitter page today that you had 176 people or so who died as a result of that Ukrainian airliner that went down, which was allegedly shot down by the Iranians. And you got the white media and the government saying there should be war now. Well, why? Because so many lives were lost. When this many lives are lost, war! Someone must be punished. Well, twice that many people died in those 737 MAX crashes. Boeing is responsible for killing more people in the last 18 months than the Iranians. Twice as many. And by the way, unlike that Ukrainian airline, 9 of the people who died in those 737 MAX crashes were Americans. And yet the white media is not saying something has to be done about Boeing. When are they going to get punished? They're not beating the drum for Boeing executives to be put on trial for handcuffs. Quite the opposite. What's happening is Boeing has been allowed to quietly settle these legal claims out of court. Keep in mind, Boeing gets huge tax breaks, which are basically amount to subsidies. And those subsidies are financed by U.S. taxpayers. That's how these big corporations get these tax breaks. It's balanced on the back of the working poor. So Boeing kills over 340 people. And they get to go to court, not to prison. They go to civil court, so they can negotiate what the payouts would be. They're paying off their victims, your and my money. Lost. Yeah, if it's a bunch of, but what if it's some white corporate executives? What if it's some white? You need to have both eyes open when it comes to this. Understand what's really at the root, friend of ours. Iran has done nothing on our behalf, and I'm not speaking up for Iran. I'm just pointing out that they hate Iran because for all these years about Robert Mugabe. If they look and say, we got to get you out of there, they'll try the old coup, they'll try the old, we'll bribe some internal elements who we know don't like him because everybody's got enemies. People didn't like his own people didn't like him. And if you do manage to defy the coup, then what we'll say is, well, the people don't like him because if they did, why did they try to overthrow him? Oh, you mean these paid stooges? Well, they tried to overthrow him, so he can't be too popular. Why? Someone tried to overthrow him. Notice how nobody ever says that the presidents of the United States who've been shot, killed, what have you, attempts on their lives, well, that proves the American people don't like you, so America needs regime change. You see, that street only goes one way. So while President Trump's sudden bout of infatuation with Iran is ultimately going to prove to be short-lived, there are some things that we should know about it. The fact that this is even happening at all says a lot. Iran is on the United States to-do list, not merely because of support for Israel, but also because of a historical bad example that the U.S. feels Iran set. And it's going to be a matter of, now we can't deal with this like they dealt with Cuba. This is different. This one is different. What's going to have to happen here is they're going to need to show the Iranian people, look at these mullahs, look at these true believers here. You're going to have to go in another direction because we're going to break these guys. And by breaking them, that's going to prove to you that your way doesn't work. Otherwise, your own would-be true believers have bent the knee. That's what the U.S. ultimately wants. Crush these guys to dust, force them to bend the knee, and this is going to break the will of the Iranian people to resist. Will they be successful? Well, if history is any guide, the answer is an unqualified no. Not because of any particular leader. The Ayatollah Khomeini's been dead for over 30 years now. And yet, for some strange reason, Iran has remained on course. One gets the idea that it's not Ayatollah Khomeini who was the driving force behind it. This is something at the grassroots. So how are you going to break the culture of an entire people? Well, you got to get them off code. And whether or not the attempts to get the Iranians off code is going to come down to the Iranian people themselves. Because in 1963, Shah Reza Pahlavi thought that he had defeated the Ayatollah Khomeini. He had the guy arrested and had him forced out of the country. I'm sure that there were more than a few days that the Shah looked and said, yeah, that guy, he said that the people were going to run me out. Look at him. Yeah. Hey, how you like things in Turkey? Oh, you're not in Turkey anymore, you're in Iraq. Oh, you're not in Iraq anymore, you're in France. Yeah, kind of hard to find a place to hang your hat these days now, isn't it? I'm sure that the Shah had a few chuckles at the Ayatollah Khomeini's expense. But what he found out was when you got a man who is speaking on behalf of a people who are on code, well, he's the one who gets the last laugh. Okay, this seems like the right time and the right place for a fresh start. Fresh start focusing on the old problem. And that is one of making sure that foundational blacks get what we're supposed to get. But you gotta do what you're supposed to do. A lot has been said about the tape, the recording of Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California back in 1971, saying what he really thought about Africans and just black people in general, in a conversation with then President Richard Nixon. Now, just to give a little bit of context, what had happened was the People's Republic of China, the communist government, the Chinese communists, they had been controlling the Chinese mainland ever since 1949. But thanks to the U.S., who didn't want to have to recognize any communist other than the Soviet Union in the UN, they had been blocking the People's Republic of China being admitted to the UN General Assembly. And instead, they took Taiwan, which was under the control of the ousted Chiang Kai-shek regime, who wasn't in control of nothing but a little island off the coast of China, and said, well, these guys, the Republic, so-called Republic of China, we're going to have them on the General Assembly, and they're going to be recognized as the Chinese government, basically the Chinese government in exile. That's what was happening. And the Taiwanese regime, they were basically saying that they had a right to the Chinese mainland. It was just going to be a little matter of time for them to figure out how they were going to assert that right. But they were making claims to mainland China. Taiwan making claim to mainland China. This was absurd, but it just goes to show how much control white supremacy has and still has over the UN, that it went on for 20 years before the UN finally decided, you know what? We're living a lie. You got to come to terms with the Chi-Coms. We can't pretend as if they're not in control of the Chinese mainland, and we're just making ourselves look stupid. So what happened was in 1971, the UN took a vote. Imagine that, the UN taking a vote on things and not just going along with what the white supremacists of the US say. And in the vote, what happened was they expelled Chiang Kai-shek's little Republic of China, the Taiwanese government making a claim that they were somehow the Republic of China. That was rejected, said, okay, Taiwan's not part of anything. And the Chi-Coms were officially recognized as a member of the UN General Assembly. Now, when that vote was taken, the Tanzanian delegation who was in attendance started dancing. And that's what Ronald Reagan got so unhappy about. And because of the fact that memories are short, let me go ahead and play for you what old Ronald the racist Reagan had to say about it.
Last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television, that did. Those monkeys from those African countries. And they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes. Well, and then the tail wags the dog there, doesn't it? Yeah, the tail wags the dog.
Ironic that old racist Reagan would say something about black folks who apparently not even knowing how to wear shoes. As Dr. John Henry Clark pointed out, the Africans already had all that stuff going before the European lived in a house that had a window or even wore a shoe. That's just a historical reality. And another reality is there were lots of countries who voted to recognize China. It wasn't just the Africans who did. In fact, the man who unearthed this racist Reagan recording, he wrote an article for The Atlantic about it, and he pointed out that Richard Nixon's own State Department blamed other factions other than the Africans. If you want to blame somebody, for the Taiwanese government being ousted from the UN and the Chi-Coms being officially recognized and made part of the UN, you could blame the British, you could blame the French and what they were doing behind the scenes, but no! Richard Nixon, as far as he was concerned, those niggers were the ones to blame. Yeah, we know that there's everybody else who actually has real power and the blacks don't have any power at all, but we're blaming the black folks because they didn't obey. And that's what the real problem was. The real problem was that the black folks didn't do what they were told. Don't blame everybody else who actually was voting on this in large numbers. Just blame a handful of Africans because, well, black folks are always to blame whatever it is. Now, you heard just how racist Ronald Reagan was on that recording. But that's not the reason why I'm bringing it up. Ronald Reagan's racism is no surprise, no bombshell. It's certainly no breaking news. It's just confirmation of what everybody had already been saying all along. So why am I talking about it? Well, I want you to understand that Ronald Reagan not merely was a racist, but he also inadvertently, in spite of himself, this is 50 years ago, mind you, he made an interesting point about whether or not the United States ought to be part of the UN and how the best thing the U.S. could do would be to withdraw from the voting process of the UN as a means of undermining the UN's legitimacy. I'm going to play for you now a clip of Ronald Reagan right after he made that racist little tirade to Richard Nixon. Here's a clip of Ronald Reagan being interviewed on the Dick Cavett show in 1971, and this is how Reagan spoke about the entire affair when he was in front of polite company.
Are you upset about, what would you say the major things are that have happened in the last year that you would consider a bad development? Of course, I'm thinking of the, I guess of the UN exclusion of Taiwan. What's that?
Yes, I was not only disappointed, I was a little indignant about that. Here is a nation that was one of the founding nations, the last of the big four, and still alive, Chiang Kai-shek from World War II. And all these years, they've abided by the bylaws and the Constitution of the United Nations. And also, while only 14 million people are on Taiwan, they have paid their dues or assessment to the UN on the basis of the 700 million Chinese on the mainland.
Yeah.
And I know the United States had recognized it didn't have the votes any longer to keep Red China out, but by dropping their opposition, the understanding was that other nations would not oust Taiwan. And the plain truth of the matter is they just plain double-crossed the United States.
And do you feel that the president should have tried harder, or his team, I mean, to
well,
think that he succeeded?
I don't know of anything they could have done. I happened to be on that Asian trip that the president asked us to make for him at the time. And meeting ambassadors in 6 of the Asian countries and meeting the heads of state of all of those countries, everyone was confident that this would not happen, that it would wind up with both China's in there, because everyone was aware of the work that had been going on in the part of our country to see that that happened. First of all, the big surprise was when the vote was taken. No one expected the vote to be taken for another month. And then there were several nations, as I say, that just deliberately broke their pledged word, went the other way. And I just, I thought that the United Nations, in that action, branded itself as a debating society, and I honestly don't believe that the United States should feel bound by any of its votes.
Did you go along with Senator Goldwater that we ought to pull out of it then?
Well, I think it'd be awfully hard, I understand he's saying it, I think it'd be awfully hard for a major nation. We all had so much hope in this organization, and still believe, and I still believe, that someday the cause of world peace is only going to come about over a table with nations willing to talk instead of fight. So I think any nation would think a long time before they would deliver the death blow, and certainly if the United States withdrew, I think it would be the death blow of the United Nations. But I think there are other things we could do. I think that the United States, for example, well, I hinted at it a moment ago, I think the United States could participate in debate, in discussion, continue to support many of the agencies as we do that are doing good works, the kind of charitable agencies and educational functions and so forth, but just not participate in the voting. And by not voting ourselves, thus remove ourselves from being bound by any votes. You see, one thing that needs reorganization is the fact that here are more than half of the nations in the United Nations today can carry a vote as a majority, and they represent less than 10% of the world's population.
You'd be for reorganizing that, one thing.
Maybe some of these people who are so strong for one man, one vote ought to consider it in regard to the UN.
We must take a pause, excuse me.
Now, of course, Ronald Reagan, who was a mediocre actor but a world-class liar, you see that all of a sudden he rediscovered his civility and good manners. Well, because he was in front of white people, no doubt. And he said that he was disappointed and a little indignant. Well, you heard what he was saying behind the scenes. He wasn't a little anything other than a little racist. And you see how he put the blame on the Africans, making sure to end his little snide remarks with some of those people who are so strong about one man, one vote ought to apply it to the UN. This coming from Ronald Reagan. Not only was he a liar, he did basic math eluded him, talking about people whose population is only a small fragment of the global population. The United States is only 5% of the world population, and yet it gets everything at once in the UN. Well, you can see how Ronald Reagan, he's sitting here telling you, one man, one vote, he don't like that idea. Yeah, a lot of Ronald Reagan's political maneuverings, especially when he ran for president, are becoming a lot more clear, aren't they? He began his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi. That's where Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were murdered in the 1960s. Yeah, Ronald Reagan knew how to get the point across to all. Forget about dog whistle. He believed in a foghorn. He didn't want to leave any doubt as to where he actually stood. It's asinine for him to be angry at the Africans. The Africans don't run the UN. They don't hold any power. They don't have the ability to sway anything. So why the hell was he singling out the black nations? For the same reason that white liberals singled out black voters in California after Proposition 8 passed. Black Californians were not the ones who put Proposition 8 over the top. Black Californians were already largely irrelevant as a voting bloc in California by that point. Proposition 8 passed by such a huge margin that even if every eligible black voter in California had voted against it, it wouldn't have meant anything. It still would have passed. So why were the white leftists and LGBT types so angry at black people? Why did they blame black people? Why were they all wagging their finger at black Californians? Why was all of their anger aimed at foundational blacks for something that we couldn't have stopped anyway? It's for the same reason that you didn't see any of these white leftists being angry at white women for voting for Trump. 2 out of 3 white women voted for Donald Trump, even though there was a recording highly publicized of him bragging about how he gropes and sexually abuses white women, and yet they went to vote for him anyway. But nobody was singling out white women. They were instead saying, you know, there were some black men who voted for Donald Trump, yeah, it was black men who put Donald Trump over the top. Wasn't those white women, it was the black men. Okay, I get it now. White supremacy is not based on anti-Asian racism. It's not based on anti-Muslim bigotry. It's not based on anti-female chauvinism. It's not based on anti-Latino racism. White supremacy is based upon and exists solely in the context of one thing: anti-black racism. That's it. Now, you may have a lot of black folks and some of these other non-black groups who are confused about that, but the white supremacists are not confused on that point at all. Doesn't matter if they're on the political right or the political left. Whenever they don't get what they want, if they think there's a chance to scapegoat black people, they're going to take it because they have black on the brain constantly. White supremacy does not measure its condition by how well these other non-white groups are doing. White supremacy measures its condition by how well, or rather poorly, black people are doing. You've never heard some white supremacist griping about how he saw a Korean at a stoplight driving a better car than him and it set him off? Mark Furman didn't say that if he saw a Latino driving a nice car, he would pull him over whether he had a reason to or not. He said if I see a black man driving a nice car and he ain't wearing a suit, which means that he doesn't think this guy has any power. If you're wearing a suit, you might be connected. You probably got a good job, which means you got some friends. So if he ain't wearing a suit, I'm pulling him over. That's what Mark Furman said, looking for soft targets. But he said only if they're black, though. White supremacy, whether it be right-wing racist like Reagan or a left-wing undercover bigot like Rachel Maddow and that gaggle of clowns at MSNBC, they are hyper-focused on controlling us. That's where this really comes from. Do we have the niggers under control? Are they doing as we said? That's what Reagan was pointing out. Oh, we had gotten all of these assurances. Yeah, because, you've been giving a couple of shekels to these corrupt leaders that white power installed in these African nations. They're obedient little pets. And, well, it seems their pets didn't roll over and play dead on cue, as the U.S. expected, and Reagan's blaming them, because as far as he was concerned, hey, all this money that we gave you few Negroes so you could buy a couple of little ghetto trinkets, and apparently you didn't toe the line, well, there's going to be hell to pay. If the white supremacists don't have control of anything else in this world, and at the rate things are going, that's quickly becoming the case, they still expect to be able to control everything that black people do. As far as they're concerned, that's supposed to be one of the immutable laws of the universe. Doesn't matter if I don't have anything else in this world, I still control these niggers. That's their mentality. Even if black people do not owe them anything, even if they don't have any leverage as far as they're concerned, black people should still do what we say anyway. So when black people defy white expectations of the UN or in California, these white supremacists lose their minds. Because the foundation of white supremacy is black subjugation, if they see black people not being forced to obey, if they see any black person who ain't toeing the line and keeping their head down and doing exactly what white power expects them to do, they immediately get disappointed and a little indignant. See, Ronald Reagan wasn't just speaking for himself. He wasn't just speaking for the racists in the Republican Party. He was speaking for all of white supremacy. That's what he was doing. After all, black people are supposed to do one thing and one thing only. Black people only exist for one reason and one reason only, to obey. White supremacy is terminally insecure with itself. That's how it got started, from a terminal insecurity, a fundamental lack of assurance, because white supremacy is a lie. It's as fake as the Easter Bunny, but it uses real violence in order to give substance to that lie, to force the rest of the world to play along with that lie. And they're terrified of the day that black people in particular decide to overthrow white supremacy, because they're standing on our heads. And when we start moving, and that's part of the reason why you got to be part of a movement, but when we start moving and we start shaking things up, we make it where white supremacy starts to lose its footing and loses its balance, and it's terrified that it will fall. And it knows it's going to fall at some point, and that we're the ones who are going to take it down. So as far as they're concerned, they got to be hyper vigilant to make sure that black people are kept under control. It's about more than Ronald Reagan. The left-wing white supremacists may bite their tongue and manage not to drop the racial slurs as often as the right-wing white supremacists, but this is a distinction without a difference. Look at how they react when black people think and act for ourselves, when we pursue our own interests, and then you'll see what they really think. And that moment you understand that there is no difference between the white right or the white left where black people's actions are concerned. The gall of this bastard to say that there were nations who deliberately broke their pledged word. Oh, you mean like the European is done with every agreement he's ever signed? The European has never signed a single agreement, not even with other Europeans, that he's ever kept. So what you're saying is these African nations are acting like the European ones, acting like the United States. The United States has not signed one agreement that it's ever kept. Not on nuclear treaties, not on trade, not on human rights. There ain't a damn agreement that the U.S. has ever signed that it's actually kept its word on. So what he's mad about is that the Africans are acting like the Europeans. The Africans gave the white supremacists a dose of their own medicine. What Reagan was mad about was he didn't have a means to immediately punish those niggers. You can't bring out the cat of nine tails now, and he was mad. All he could do was fume on a late-night TV show. Well, that is until he became president. Then all of a sudden, as far as he was concerned, now we're going to pay back those niggers through all sorts of retributive policies. Yeah, it's time for some payback now. We're going to do the payback through policy. I remember that after Reagan died, may he roast in hell, you had Sam Donaldson of ABC talking about, he had a bunch of panels on all the TV shows doing their reminiscences of old Reagan, that old codger. And one of the people who was talking was Sam Donaldson from ABC News, and he was relating a story about how Desmond Tutu, the very confused bishop from South Africa, how during the 80s he had gone to President Reagan to ask for the U.S. support in helping to do something about the Dutch occupation regime in South Africa. I don't call them the South African government. They were never a South African government. No. They were a Dutch occupation regime, who are still there, by the way. And Desmond Tutu was asking Reagan, hey, you know dang well the U.S. is talking out of both sides of its neck, trying to talk about how the U.S. is so high-minded and so progressive and egalitarian, and you're supporting the apartheid regime there in South Africa. You got to knock it off. And when the meeting was over, one of Ronald Reagan's aides asked Ronald Reagan how the meeting went. Because you know how it went. The U.S. continued to support the Dutch occupation regime until the day it collapsed. But what was Reagan's response to Desmond Tutu's entreaties when he was asked about it? Hey, Ronald, how did your meeting go? According to Sam Donaldson, Reagan said, Tutu, so-so. You saw what the hell kind of animalistic barbarity the Dutch occupation regime was carrying out in South Africa, which, by the way, they had the full backing of the U.S. government. The U.S. is giving them money, giving them weaponry, even giving them technology, just to make sure that that apartheid regime didn't fall. You know, that old saying about that Dr. King said about injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Well, the opposite is also true. Black empowerment anywhere is a threat to white supremacy everywhere. Anytime that a white supremacist regime can be overthrown by black power, that is an existential threat to white supremacy. That's the reason why they were so crazed about the Haitian Revolution. Thomas Jefferson was letting old Napoleon Bonaparte know, hey, you gotta hold the line in Haiti, because if it crumbles there, it's gonna start a domino effect. It's gonna go bad for everybody, so you better hold the line. But we could go on all night about Ronald Reagan's complete and thorough hypocrisy, his racist bile and all the rest of it, but this is old hat. The fact that all we're saying is white supremacy lies, that's not the reason why I brought this up. By the way, I saved this video clip months and months ago, long before Reagan's racist recording came to light. And the reason that I decided that I want to save this little video clip was because what Reagan was talking about got my attention, not his disappointment and little indignation at black people acting for themselves, but it was what Ronald Reagan said that the U.S.'s response ought to be because it didn't get its way in the UN. He was talking about what should the U.S.'s, rather, let me rephrase that. He was talking about what white supremacy's response should be when it doesn't get its way in some sort of vote. If a vote is taken and white supremacy doesn't get its way, what should white supremacy's response be?
But I think there are other things we could do. I think that the United States, for example, well, I hinted at it a moment ago, I think the United States could participate in debate, in discussion, continue to support many of the agencies as we do that are doing good works, the kind of charitable agencies and educational functions and so forth, but just not participate in the voting. And by not voting ourselves, thus remove ourselves from being bound by any votes. You see, one thing that needs reorganization is the fact that here are more than half of the nations in the United Nations today can carry a vote as a majority, and they represent less than 10% of the world's population.
You'd be for reorganizing that, for one thing.
And what did Reagan say the white power should do? Participate in debate and discussion. That was the first thing he said. We should continue to participate in debate and discussion. Oh, so what that means is just because you're not in the process doesn't mean you stop trying to influence that process. Doesn't mean that you stop trying to have influence in the debate and public discourse. Oh, the talk is going on. You're still there. You're still a part of it, but you're making it known. Long as this deliberative body, long as the voting powers that be refuse to do what I want, don't expect me to legitimize this system, but I'm still going to have a voice in it. You're still going to have to hear my mouth. I still expect to be able to influence and otherwise have some means of putting my own spin on the discourse going on around this or that issue. So that's the first thing. We ain't going to stop talking. We're going to be part of the debate. 2, he said to continue to support many of the agencies doing good work. Coming from Ronald Reagan, that's a joke. But he talked about educational initiatives. When he says educational initiatives, what he's talking about is propaganda. That's what he means. Teach these African nations to adopt and enact all kinds of policies that will be detrimental to them. Teach these people, educate them to trust their enemies. That's what he meant by education and such. And also when he says agencies doing good work, the charitable agencies, he's talking about what are basically CIA front groups. These aid organizations like USAID and others who claim to be relief organizations, they're nothing more than clumsy fronts for American intelligence operatives. A lot of these people going into these African countries claiming to be part of some aid mission, they are government operatives. They're saying, oh, we want to get everybody vaccinated. Yeah, and you don't know what the hell they're injecting you with now, do you? And saying, oh, we're here to feed people. Yeah, and at the same time, you're also making sure to tell them you don't need to have your own farms. White power is going to feed you. Well, they're going to feed you while they tell you sit on your hands and don't grow your own. These so-called relief organizations that Reagan's talking about, half the people who are in these things are nothing more than employees for the State Department or employees for the U.S. Army. Or they happen to be snuck in there by certain politically connected U.S. corporations, all of them trying to figure out where the minerals are at, where's the gold deposits at, where are the natural resources at. These are the people who tell these African nations that they had better promote abortion or whatever sexual lifestyle choice the U.S. tells you to. You better support this stuff and promote it in your own countries. And stop reclaiming the land for your people. Stop nationalizing the industries for your people's benefit. And you better stop pushing the white supremacists off the land that they stole from you and have been holding through brutality and corruption from you. That's what these relief organizations have. They got all sorts of people in there who show up and they make it very clear, you know, we got a little more heft than the rest of these worker bee relief employees over here. That's how they sneak their people in. These relief organizations that Reagan was talking about, these aid organizations, they'll often have bag men for the CIA as part of their group. That's how a lot of these CIA bag men get in. So these are not aid workers at all. These happen to be intruders for foreign governments, infiltrators, who are gathering information about these African countries, seeing if there's any dissident elements or otherwise disaffected traitors in the society who they can give some guns to, and these are going to be the rebels. Yeah, if your government refuses to play ball, then don't worry. While we were busy trying to bribe you and you didn't take the bait, we were also looking around to see if there was anybody who doesn't like you. And we're trying to encourage them and tell them that you're a bad guy and your government is bad. And we'll give them all the guns they need and why they'll be the new regime once they overthrow you. And you wonder how it is that these countries are dirt poor. They ain't got enough money for people to buy clothes, and yet people got AK-47s and rocket launchers and grenades. How the hell are they able to afford that in a country where the people don't even make $300 a year? Now, you know that comes from outside, and that's how these aid organizations work. Those crates that they have are not full of food. They're full of assault rifles and rocket launchers. That's what Reagan's talking about. We're going to continue to have these aid organizations, destabilizing governments who are sitting on resources that the U.S. covets. These aid workers show up and they try to sweet talk the locals into telling them any information that they can use against those countries. If you ever saw TV shows like Narcos talking about the drug war in Colombia, that's what was going on with that DEA agent. His wife was in Colombia claiming that she was a teacher, and maybe she was, but her husband wasn't no teacher. He was DEA. Except she didn't say anything about that. Yeah, you think that what's her husband? My husband's a consultant. Yeah, he's a consultant, all right. A consultant for the DEA. But that's what these guys do. That's what these aid organizations are. They're nothing more than front groups for intelligence operations against these African nations. The U.S. uses these so-called aid organizations as a means to sneak their spies into these African countries in order to scope them out. That's what Reagan said we need to continue to do. White power needs to continue to go ahead and promote these aid organizations because Reagan understands what they really are and what they really do. You don't, but he does. So that's the thing. We don't stop trying to fight the war against white supremacy. We ain't sitting on our hands. We're not taking a coffee break. What we're doing is we're not encouraging black people to play along with the system that has never been in our interest. We are going to break the system to our will. But first, we got to be honest about the fact that this system, as it's currently constituted, isn't going to be working for us. We got to get serious about that and accept the reality. Reagan wasn't talking about white power sitting at home and sulking while the UN does what it wants. He's talking about rendering the UN irrelevant. That's why he specifically used the word reorganization. You saw how he stopped himself in mid-sentence just so he could throw that in there. He stopped himself. His train of thought derailed so he could get in the word reorganization. We're talking about a reorganization here. See, it's not about sitting in the corner and sulking. It's about collectively organizing your numbers in order to undermine a group who's working against your interests. But he made it clear when you don't vote, you're not bound by whatever decision the group you're abstaining from makes. If I am abstaining from voting in your group, then you're not going to hold me to any of your decisions. Those are your decisions, not mine. He's talking about weaponizing the voting process, weaponizing your ballot. Not merely in how you use it, but also in how you don't use it. Because you see, Ronald Reagan, for all of his racism, he understands the purpose that voting serves in any setting or any society. And that's part of what I try to get you to understand. That's the reason why I keep hammering that point so much. Voting is about a hell of a lot more than just having your say in who's going to be sitting on this or that board, who's going to be sitting on this or that council, who's going to be sitting in this or that chief executive seat. The 1% are the smallest voting bloc in the country, but they win every election no matter who they voted for. Voting is a means of taking a poll, a nationwide, society-wide poll, to see how many people in the country are still going to go along with whatever the decision is. Because when you have people, voting engagement is at an all-time high, what that means is you can go ahead and put Barack Obama in the presidency and he'll let black people be shot in the streets. You ain't got to worry about a revolution because the people already said we will abide by whatever decision Barack Obama makes. That's what your vote is. Your vote is a vote of confidence in the system. It doesn't matter which side you vote for. The fact that you're participating means that you believe in this system, because that's what a vote means. When you agree to be part of an electoral body, if you choose to be part of a constituency, what you're saying is, I will agree to and abide by whatever decision comes out of this process. Even if it's a decision that says that I can be shot in the streets with absolutely no punishment for the killers, I will abide by that. That's what voting really means. Voting is you submitting to the system, and whatever comes out of the other end of that process, whatever policies that system chooses to enact, you're saying, I am giving a vote of confidence to it. But when you say, to hell with this, I'm abstaining from this, I object to the whole damn system, when you say, no more, I'm not going along with this anymore, what you are doing is you are giving a vote of no confidence. And when you decide that this or that group or this or that person or this or that organization is irrelevant, what you've done is you've also said that they're illegitimate. And haven't I always taught you that when you declare a person or a group or an organization or a particular idea to be illegitimate, you can do anything to that. You can disobey it, you can fight against it, you can destroy it. That's the power of saying, I'm not going along with this anymore, because what it says to establish power is they got an organized group who are effectively working against the system now. They have withdrawn from it. That's what Japan did when the U.S. was cutting off their oil supplies in the League of Nations, the precursor to the UN. When the League of Nations wasn't giving Japan what it wanted, Japan said, to hell with this. You know, we're not going to stop our aggression in China. China's got resources, we want it. The European did it all throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Well, we're doing it in the 20th. And the Japanese left the League of Nations, which, by the way, was the death knell for the League of Nations. Japan then, as now, was an influential member of the international community. You couldn't have Japan say, we're not going to be part of this group anymore, and think the group was going to have any influence in Asia. You got one of the greatest powers in Asia saying we ain't going along with it. That was the end of the League of Nations. You could write off any influence in Asia after that. That's what Reagan meant by if the U.S. pulls out of the UN, that'd be the end of the UN. He understood exactly how that worked. And black people need to understand that even with 5% of the world population, the U.S. exercised disproportionate influence. We're a hell of a lot more than 5% of the population of the U.S. Time to throw our weight around. Stop it with trying to make everybody happy with you. They'll never be happy with you unless you are completely and thoroughly disempowered, which is only one step away from being dead, which is what the real goal is. A slow-moving genocide, but one that allows white power to be able to point at us and say, well, the black people went extinct in America, but you know, it was something that they were doing, or perhaps something they weren't doing, but you can't blame us. You cannot blame us. Why? The black people were voting all the time, and it's just those people that they kept choosing. It must have been all their fault. You see, white power understands that when you keep voting, you're saying, I believe in this system. That means you're not going to fight it. You're trying to change the system according to the system's own rules, according to the system's own rules and regulations. Because people who vote are not in revolt. The two cancel each other out. The people who believe and go to the ballot box and they're out there trying to get candidate so-and-so into office, these are not people who are going to be saying revolt, because if you're in revolt, what that means is you don't recognize the authority of the government. You're declaring the government illegitimate. The two cancel each other out. You can't be fighting for a candidate to get into office and at the same time say that the government, its processes and its policies are completely illegitimate. You can't fight the system and build it at the same time. I'm trying to teach you to see the institutions of the society, and the elections are one of those institutions. See the institutions in this society the way that white supremacy does. Black people don't think like this because most of us are very short-sighted. Most of us don't know much, and the people who don't know much are usually the ones slamming their gums the most. And tragically, they're the ones who black people are most likely to follow. This is why we get the practice of elections and the practice of voting totally backwards. The ballot box is the last step in the voting process, but we treat it like it's the end-all and be-all. Let me tell you something, by the time you get to the ballot box, it's too damn late for you to have an effect on who gets elected or what policies they're going to put in place. By the time, the entire point of an election is to choose who gets what. But if by the time you get to the ballot box, if that's when you're making your choice, then you have no chance. The time for you to make your voice heard, the time for you to vote is before election day, before the campaigns, before the primaries, hell, before the candidates even start stumping for support. The time for you to vote is when you're choosing who is even going to run. That's the time for you to vote. And that choice has to be completely and thoroughly yours. You got to stop playing the fool for this or that political party. Stop letting them dictate to you that you get to choose from white supremacist candidate A or white supremacist candidate B. That's no choice at all. But that is what Ronald Reagan and the U.S. thought that they had done to the Africans in 1971. They thought that they were dictating to the Africans what they were going to do as it pertained to the vote on whether or not the People's Republic of China was in or out. They thought, oh, we already got you guys to say that the People's Republic of China has no chance. Yeah, we're going to have Chiang Kai-shek and his little irrelevant minority being recognized because we're rendering the Chi-Coms politically irrelevant. At least that's what they thought. But the Africans turned the tables on the bastards. And the Africans pursued their own interests, if nothing more than as an act of self-determination. Well, just as we get the voting process backwards, foundational blacks also get the concept of leveraging our vote backwards as well. When you abstain from voting, that isn't the end of the process. It's just the beginning. You don't sit at home on election day. You don't make yourself irrelevant. Hell, Reagan, as much of an irredeemable, satanic, evil bastard racist as he was, he understood how power actually works when it comes to voting. And that's part of the reason why he got what he wanted and we don't. The bad guys, if they are doing what power demands, if they're understanding how power actually works, as wretched as they are, they will still win every time. And even as virtuous as you may be, as moral as you may be, as ethical as you may be, if you are naive, if you are ignorant about the way that power actually works, then you will lose every single time. And eventually what you'll lose will not just be your power, you won't just lose your comfort, you just won't lose your peace of mind, you'll wind up losing your life and the lives of those dear to you. You continue to make your voice heard in whatever national discourse is going on. You continue to push your influence and to undermine those who is. You stop playing the game of giving a vote of confidence to a system that ain't doing a damn thing for you. Do you get it now? That's the reason why abstaining from voting matters. That's the reason why. We don't stop talking, but we make it clear to everybody. Nah, we're not going to be re-engaging with this system until our agenda is on the ballot. That's the point that Reagan was getting across. Well, he was getting that across to white folks because they understood it. Black people are just now figuring this out. Abstaining from voting is a means to an end, not an end unto itself. Now, to some of you, that's probably worse than if I had told you, well, sitting at home on election day, that's all we're going to do. Because when I say that abstaining from voting is just the beginning, that means that there's a hell of a lot more work you're going to have to do, which means you're going to have to stop goofing off and you're going to have to put in some work to get your power. And to a lot of black folks, that's a turnoff. But you know what? For the black folks who don't believe in getting some sweat on your brow in order to get your power, this ain't for you. Professor Truth alone, because I got no patience for you. Voting is a business transaction. It's time for us to make it where the black vote has to be bought, and we are the ones who set the price. Ain't gonna be no haggling over this vote. The price that I put on the black vote, we don't get to haggle over that. It's non-negotiable, and no, I'm not going to be reducing it. The black vote is worth minimum $20 trillion, and that's just the down payment. Tangibles is a hell of a lot more than just our reparations, the lump sum for our reparations. Tangibles is what we would have to get under any circumstances, even if slavery had never happened. If you're a citizen of a country, the entire point of the nation is to take whatever the nation's resources are and make sure that the maximum number of people have access to them so that they have maximum ability to be able to improve their lives. That's what tangibles are. I need some real world resources so that I can make something of myself and my progeny so that we can have the best life possible. That's what tangibles are about. A nation is supposed to provide material resources to the citizens. The resources cannot and must not be the private preserve of only a few wealthy elites or a few well-connected, well-heeled plutocrats, and it cannot be just the sole preserve of those whose skin color is the right color. No, tangibles is a hell of a lot more than reparations. Reparations is just the beginning. And the price of our vote, we're the ones who set that. That value of the black vote isn't determined by other people. Damn sure not by the left hand or white hands of white supremacy. We're the ones who set that price. Now, convincing this country that we finally mean business, we got to accept the fact that this is going to take some time. We're not going to get this first try at bat. Why? Because we have spent, or rather misspent, the last 150 years being consistently inconsistent. Oh, sure, we've had a few moments where we threw our weight around for a hot minute and got tough with white supremacy, but only for a hot minute. We blew off some steam and then we walk away without ever having taken our power. So white supremacists looked at this. They've seen this for 150 years. Every time the Negroes get a head full of steam, don't worry, they're just having a temper tantrum. Wait them out, they'll go away. All you got to do is say no and they'll realize, okay. They're just, let them get it out of their system and they'll be fine. That's what they think this is. They think that this is us getting it out of our system, but they've been listening to the talk coming from the new voices of black media. And they realize this storm is different. This is qualitatively different. We're in this for the long haul. This ain't a matter of blowing off some steam. They understand that. So what has happened is they've tried to see if they could hijack this movement. They've tried to see if they could send some of their hand-picked black bootlicks to Capitol Hill or put their hand-picked black bootlicks on the voting ballot. Let's go ahead and see if we can find some black puppets who will tell these Negroes, oh, you're getting what you want. No, what's happening is we're taking the hard line. We're demanding that they do what we say. What that means is when I tell you that they have to take the pledge, when we tell you that they got to be committed, what that means is they have to be our puppet. They have to repeat to us verbatim exactly what we say, exactly the way that we say it. They don't get to add to it or take away from it. We don't need them to say what they think we mean. They only need to say exactly what we tell them to say. And we're not letting them get away with saying that, oh, well, you know, to me, reparations is, nobody asked what it is to you. Well, you know, what I think, well, I don't care what you think. Well, you know, it's like Bernie said, well, you know, if you ask me, nobody asked you, Bernie. And nobody asked Kamala either. And nobody asked Marianne Williamson. Nobody asked them what they think. They're being told what they're going to do. This is going to be a new thing for them. When they realize that we're serious about this and they can't get us off our square and that they're not going to wait us out. White supremacy has always used those kind of tactics. Wait the Negroes out. Just tell them flat out no and wait them out. They'll give up.
Oh, shit.
They'll go away. They'll understand that they never had a chance. Everyone tells us that we have no right to demand anything. When we demand what we're supposed to have, that's a handout. See, everyone else, when they get something, it's aid, or if you're a corporation, it's a subsidy, or it's always an investment. Okay, you gave a lot of money to group XYZ, or to corporation XYZ, or to interest XYZ. You didn't get a damn thing. You ain't got squat to show for it. But that doesn't matter. It was an investment. Yeah, an investment that doesn't produce anything. But for us, that's the best kind of investment possible. You get immediate dividends as far as white power is concerned. Nah, you guys just want something for nothing. No, something for nothing is what this country got and has gotten every day for 500 years off of our black backs. Freebies given to people who did nothing to earn it and don't even need it. But for the people who did earn it, the most deserving constituency of all, we're told that we want something for nothing. No, we're putting an end to the lies. So that's the reason why I decided that we needed to go ahead and focus on Ronald Reagan's little racism and what came out of it, because it was very interesting, not merely Reagan's bigotry, which is no surprise, that's not a newsflash, it deserves very little mention. What's interesting is Ronald Reagan, when he explained what ought to be done when your vote seems to not produce anything. What do you do in regards to a system that is not responsive to your desires for power? A system that is not responsive to your interests, a system that is hostile to your interests. What do you do? Well, the first step is you disengage. Family, I've had to think long and hard about whether or not to do this video essay. I thought to do it yesterday, but it's just one of those facts that there are some things that black folks don't tend to handle very well. Sports, entertainment's one of them, but anything that even smacks of conspiracy, black people sometimes get a little carried away. So I had to think before I decided whether or not I wanted to get out here with this. Now, with Jeffrey Epstein's death, a lot of people are trying to very hurriedly drive nails into the story and say, well, there's nothing to see here. And I know that yesterday on my Twitter page I said that I was having the last word about it and wasn't going to say anything else, but there's something that I want to speak about that Jeffrey Epstein can be used as an entree for, and that is how organized power protects itself. Jeffrey Epstein was a man whose money was made in ways that we still don't understand. There are people who he was connected to, but it's still unclear exactly where his money came from. And as the old saying goes, behind every great fortune lies an even greater crime. But when you look at Jeffrey Epstein's past business associates and the men who he had business partnerships with, you see a bunch of them are in federal prison now for Ponzi schemes, money laundering, and various other forms of financial chicanery. But it's Jeffrey Epstein's story personally that's the most interesting. Now, according to the Daily Beast, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly where they got this information from. It's been reported and echoed by Forbes. This a month ago. They were talking about the reason why Alex Acosta, the former U.S. attorney in Miami, who gave Jeffrey Epstein that sweetheart plea deal back in 2007, when he was being interviewed for a job in the Trump administration, the issue of Jeffrey Epstein came up. How could it not? Jeffrey Epstein had been connected to Donald Trump very briefly. Now again, still trying to figure out exactly what the source is other than the reporter saying she heard it from a former senior administration official. But according to the story, Alex Acosta said, I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. The Labor Department had no comment when they were asked about it. Now, as you're aware, as one of the new voices of black media, I am very, very loath to be repeating any sort of information that I don't actually have sourcing for. So this is the reason why I say take it with a grain of salt, but given how strange it is that Jeffrey Epstein had been on the hook for being part of a pedophile ring 12 years ago, and yet this man gets a sweetheart deal, and nobody seems to want to talk about it, and just the strangeness of the legality. Not only was he taking a plea for himself, he was also accepting a plea for all of the people who might have been his co-conspirators, which, by the way, the law doesn't allow you to do. You can take a plea deal for yourself, but you're not allowed to take a plea deal on behalf of a third party. Yeah, everybody's got to basically take a plea for themselves. It's a matter of the federal government was making it. They were going overboard to say, not only are we not going to do anything to you, we're not going to even pursue this issue. That's a little bit too convenient. You would think the media would be all over it, but they're not. They're not asking the real questions. And it's obvious that Epstein was being protected. He was being protected by a lot of people because he had given a lot of money, but he was also very useful. The more that you look at Jeffrey Epstein, it kind of reminds you of Howard Hunt. E. Howard Hunt was one of the Watergate conspirators, and truth be told, he was essentially a bag man for Nixon in all but name. He may not necessarily have been running around with the bags full of cash. Hunt himself had received money from the Nixon administration in return for his silence. But when you look at Jeffrey Epstein, he seems to be one of those guys who, when it comes to money and powerful men in Washington, it ain't long before the intelligence services are not very far behind. That's what the whole Iran-Contra thing was about. Arms for hostages, but also drugs for money in order to try to stop the spread of communism in Central America. So the ties between money and the political class are just money, the political class, and the intelligence services, they go hand in hand. You really can't have any one without the other two, because they all protect each other. And speaking of protection, Jeffrey Epstein was also being protected by the Fourth Estate. It was the reason that the ties to him in intelligence, if to the extent that they do exist, and I would say we should put an asterisk beside it, because we haven't sourced this ourselves, but it all does make sense. It certainly has the ring of truth to it. It certainly seems plausible. And considering the highly strange circumstances under which the late Mr. Epstein has expired, yeah, it looks like somebody decided they had him fitted for a toe tag and they wanted it tied. And why is the white media not asking the tough questions about Epstein? Why weren't they asking them 12 years ago? Well, look at who it is who are his close pals. Mort Zuckerman, the former media mogul, billionaire, former owner of the New York Daily News and the Atlantic. Bill Barr, the current United States Attorney General. Bill Barr's family was friends with Jeffrey Epstein. Bill Barr's own father got Epstein a job at a prestigious prep school in New York. That's exactly what you want, by the way. You want a pedophile to have a job teaching children. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Naturally, of course, Epstein was friends with Harvey Weinstein. Epstein would hold lavish dinners, and some of the guests at these dinners, co-founder Sergey Brin, Google is the parent company, but also Jeffrey Bezos has been known to be in attendance at a Jeffrey Epstein party. Bezos, by the way, is the owner of Amazon, and he's also the owner of the Washington Post. And speaking of which, as the paper of record inside the Beltway, one would have thought that the Washington Post would have been the first to crack the Epstein story. But for some strange reason, they were the last to know. And this tardiness on their part, their being completely out of the loop, doesn't seem to bother the crowd inside the Beltway. As the Washington Post reported last month, Epstein's little black book, his personal phone directory that his butler ran off with, was obtained by the FBI, and it listed the most influential men in media: Rupert Murdoch, but also former New York mayor and media mogul Michael Bloomberg. Though for some strange reason, Jeff Bezos' name never seems to make it into the Washington Post coverage of Jeffrey Epstein's high-powered pals. Gee, wonder why that is. You see the names here, big names, huge names, the biggest names. In other words, the men who own the agenda-setting media. Agenda-setting meaning this is what's supposed to dominate the news cycle today. When they talk about something, this is all planned out. It's a matter of what are we going to be focusing on so that nobody asks any questions about the real things that really matter. So that's the reason why the Washington Post wasn't terribly interested in them. Call it a tale of two Jeffs, Jeff Epstein and Jeff Bezos. One hand washes the other. And that's the reason why a newspaper down in Miami that most folks have never even heard of, that's the reason why they had to crack the story. Because the big boys who actually were the ones chasing Bill Clinton around and were the ones who hobnobbed with the movie stars and the tech moguls and the media moguls that Epstein was bumping elbows with, that media couldn't be bothered. This is how dangerous it is when you don't have a media that operates in your interest. This is how dangerous it is, family. You can have freaking pedophiles running around doing all sorts of God knows what, and you don't have a clue about them. Because the people whose job it's supposed to be to keep you informed, well, they're sleeping at the wheel. Forget about sleeping at the wheel. These guys have made up their minds they're going to protect the pedophiles and the predators. See, Shea Butter Twitter's not terribly interested in Jeff Epstein either. There's another group who ain't terribly interested in him. Because Shea Butter Twitter is nothing more than sock puppets for white supremacy. Their job is to help white supremacy keep all the attention on R. Kelly, on Bill Cosby, on Anthony Anderson. Keep it on black men. That way you never talk about Jeff Epstein. By the way, you notice how the clowns in the Shea Butter Twitter brigade, those morons never bothered to ask how many black girls did Jeff Epstein recruit for his child sex ring? How many black girls wound up finding themselves on Pedophile Island, finding themselves on the Lolita Express? How many of them wound up on Orgy Island having to service Jeffrey Epstein and his powerful friends? Notice how the Shea Butter clowns, the black feminists, have no interest in that whatsoever. None of them have asked how many black girls. You know damn well down there in Miami, which is part of the Deep South, everybody thinks of Florida as East Coast, like it's not part of the South. It's part of the South, okay? Man. You know damn well that there had to be at least a few black girls that Jeffrey Epstein and his pedophile pals got their clutches on. I'm interested in that. That's something I want to know about. What a shame the black feminists could give less than a damn. But they will be concerned about R. Kelly. That they will be concerned about. Because R. Kelly is the right color. And they know the white media, who they desperately want to pat on their head from, they're concerned about that too. Yeah, white supremacy relies on a lot of people to help protect the Jeff Epsteins. The intelligence services, allegedly. The white media, definitely. And their bootlicks within the black community, such as these black feminists, definitely. A lot of people helping to protect this guy, either directly or indirectly. So the white media wasn't about to put Jeffrey Epstein's name out there because they would actually have to investigate themselves. Even now, with the man only just a week ago having tried to kill himself, the question now becomes, did Jeffrey Epstein really try to kill himself a week ago, or had he barely survived a murder attempt? Well, even so, after that, with people saying, well, hey, the story is Jeff Epstein tried to kill himself. Well, he's on suicide watch, right? Wrong. No suicide watch for this guy. The most important federal case in the country, the most important high-profile federal inmate in the nation, and the government leaves him alone after he allegedly tried to kill himself? Only a fool wouldn't think that that's just a little bit suspicious. That a man this connected and who had so much juice that he could get a massive child rape case against him to disappear 12 years ago, he would suddenly want to off himself. And no one's supposed to think that's strange. It would have been one thing if he had died the first time. But he lived after the first alleged suicide attempt. He died after the second one. And already Rupert Murdoch's own Wall Street Journal, the voice of the investor class, is reporting that anyone who thinks Epstein was connected to the government is spreading conspiracy theories. Yeah, just because he had Bill Clinton on his plane, and just because he was good friends with the current Attorney General's family, and just because he could get a federal case for running a pedophile ring squashed like that, like a snap of his fingers. Just because this man was connected to all kinds of government officials all over the world, including the Saudi royal family, that doesn't mean that he's connected to the government. He just has these guys on speed dial, literally. He has private retreats where he brings the most powerful men in the world, but that doesn't mean that he's connected to the intelligence services. I mean, surely he has no interest in the FBI, especially not when the Justice Department brought a pedophile case against him and he got it thrown out. That doesn't mean that he has any connections in the government, mind you. Even though the case was thrown out under just the most cursory, just the lightest of examinations, you look and go, wait a minute here. Some of this stuff has never happened in the history of jurisprudence in the U.S., but it happened for him. But that doesn't mean anything. This is what Rupert Murdoch's rag is saying. They even took out some time to lament the fact that all of these conspiracy theories will make it just that much harder for people to accept the official version when the facts all come to light. Now, ain't this the same Wall Street Journal who's always saying that the government can't do anything right, the private industry can do it better? Yeah, but when it comes to the death of this former tool of white supremacy, all of a sudden, we really ought to believe what the government tells us. The government wouldn't lie to us, and we don't need people out here trying to figure things out for themselves. You just need to believe what the government tells you. Yeah, that's because government is the shadow cast by business, and the Wall Street Journal happens to be the mouthpiece of business in America. This is how the Wall Street Journal is reporting on Jeffrey Epstein. That if you ask whether or not this man had connections with the government beyond merely hanging out with his fellow horn dogs, then apparently you're spreading conspiracy theories. Oh, and by the way, the Wall Street Journal also made it a point to point out that Twitter and Facebook and Google, they would be cracking down on people who would be spreading such irresponsible claims. Yeah, I'll bet they would. I'll bet that Google would love to shut up anyone talking about that. What's this conspiracy theory stuff? It ain't a theory if it's got something to substantiate it. But this is what power does. First, what power tries to do is they try to insulate those who have been beneficial to it. But there's a devil's bargain that you got to make with white supremacy. White supremacy has never had a tool that it has not eventually broken in the end. Either out of preference, that the tool be destroyed so it can't be used against them in the future, or, as it would seem in the case of Jeffrey Epstein, out of necessity. But that's how these things work. In the beginning, when it seemed that when nobody knew who Jeffrey Epstein was, and it would be easy to get a case against him to go away, because, I mean, who the hell cared, right? Well, white power looked and said, hey, we're going to protect ourselves by getting this case off of Jeffrey Epstein's back. But when the case just inconveniently reared its head, white power started looking at Jeffrey Epstein and going, you know what? Under the circumstances, old Jeffrey might be a lot more valuable to us dead than alive. And the white media is already trying to give itself permission to say, okay, nothing to see here, sorry, the old Jeffrey Epstein matter died with him. Well, what about his pals, his rich and famous pals? Well, that's conspiracy theory stuff, And Twitter's going to crack down on it, And Facebook and Google, this conspiracy stuff has got to stop, Yeah, I guess they figured they couldn't say Russian bots this time around. They couldn't say Russian bots. So instead, it's conspiracy theory. This is what happens when white power sees that it's losing its grip on power. When there's just too many people who are actually asking the tough questions, and you don't need ABC, NBC, and the journalism. What happens is other people start doing it. But the thing is, we don't want a situation where we are dependent on any white media outlet, no matter how occasionally useful they may seem. We want to be the ones who are in complete and thorough control of the information that we get. This is the reason why black media, we're going to have to make sure that we start having people who can tell us things. That's going to be the next step, by the way. Having people who talk to us. Hey, WikiLeaks can do it. So if some of these other chumps can do it, we can do it too. It won't be easy. It won't be quick. But this has to be on the agenda. Because the problem happens to be that while we got the white supremacists who own the white media and their meat puppets, massive, big, fat, sloppy, obese meat puppets like the Shea Butter crowd, these clowns, they're going to be running interference for the Jeffrey Epsteins, and they're going to be trying to make some high-profile prosecutions of black people in the meanwhile to serve as a distraction for these guys. They get to kill two birds with one stone, protect a useful tool for white supremacy, and turn up and ratchet up the attacks on black people in the process. Yeah, they know exactly how to run a multi-pronged protection racket. Well, we don't have to play along with it. Understand how white power actually operates. Understand when you're talking about things that white power wants you to stop talking about. They're not even being subtle about this. Jeffrey Epstein, however, is merely the tip of a very large, very ugly iceberg. We're getting a glimpse into how it is that power operates. In his book, Blind Ambition, John Dean, who was the White House counsel for Richard Nixon during his second administration, John Dean talked about how after the Watergate break-in, Richard Nixon was trying to figure out how to make the Justice Department probe go away, how to get the special prosecutor in the Justice Department to back off. And what
Alright, cutting it short. Be back in a minute. Shoulin for every. Holla back. If you like what you see, hit that like button. If you want to see more, hit the subscribe button and ring that bell. Yeah, until the next time, black first.
Nixon did was he contacted Richard Helms, who was the